G'day, I'm Josh Sepps, and this is The People Versus, the show where you, the people, unpick one tangled ethical problem that's been raised by the news. If you've heard the Facebook debacle and all the debates about online privacy, but you don't quite know what to think about them, you're in luck. Today you'll hear from experts and from listeners in ABC studios around Australia to deliberate and debate what's right and wrong. You can join us on future shows by going to the RN homepage, following the links to The People Versus, and putting your hand up to be one of the people's people, as well as chiming in via Facebook, Twitter, voicemail, and, for a rare few, telepathy. This week, it's The People versus privacy. Facebook, what have you done? You'll have seen footage of the creator and CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, in the hot seat, being grilled by America's legislators about Facebook's leak of the personal data of over 87 million users. Here's Democratic Senator Dick Durbin quizzing Zuckerberg at the Senate hearings in Washington last week.
Mr. Zuckerberg, would you be comfortable sharing with us the name of the hotel you stayed in last night?
No.
If you've messaged anybody this week, would you share with us the names of the people you've messaged?
Senator, no, I would probably not choose to do that publicly here.
I think that may be what this is all about. Your right to privacy, the limits of your right to privacy, and how much you give away in modern America in the name of, quote, connecting people around the world. The question basically of what information Facebook's collecting, who they're sending it to, and whether they ever asked me in advance my permission to do that. Is that a fair thing for a user of Facebook to expect?
Yes, Senator. I think everyone should have control over how their information is used.
That's Mark Zuckerberg last week speaking with Democratic Senator Dick Durbin in Washington. Just to recap what happened. In 2013, Facebook allowed an app developer to post cute online surveys that users could complete and share with their friends. They had titles like The Sex Compass and This Is Your Digital Life. But the point of the app was not actually what it seemed, not the survey itself. The point of it was that to do the survey, you had to click agree, and agreeing gave the developer access not only to all of your data, but to all of your friends' data. So a few 100,000 people did the survey and unwittingly released the psychological profiles of tens of millions of other Facebook users. Then a political consulting firm that you've probably heard of, Cambridge Analytica, used all of that detail about those users to target them with incredibly precise political messages during the US elections in 2016. And analysts say that the targeting of those precise political messages on Facebook, including not just ads, but bogus news stories to specific voters based on microdata about their personality types, maybe with the help of Russia, could have boosted Donald Trump's vote in key states. And this impacts all of us. An estimated 300,000 Australians were included in the breach. In the US, more than 220 million people use digital platforms like Instagram and Twitter every day. Facebook itself has over 2.2 billion, with a B, users worldwide. So today, on The People Versus, is there any hope of retaining privacy? Is there even a real appetite to retain privacy in a world where so much of what we do, from sharing photos of our kids to reading news articles to shopping for books to sending instant messages to joining community groups to following a band to searching for a local Thai takeaway place, all of it is mediated by a few gigantic companies who connect the dots on it all. Here to wrestle with these thorny but timely moral questions are, as always on The People Versus, three of the people's people. Regular listeners in ABC studios around Australia. Kat is in Melbourne, Weston is from Orange, he joins us from Newcastle, and Erica is in Mackay, Queensland. Welcome to all of you. Plus our brains trusts. One is a technology futurist, Shara Evans, and the other an ethicist, Tim Dean. We will meet them in a moment. We'll hear from them in just a sec, but let's begin by spending about 10 minutes with one of Australia's leading experts on digital privacy, Mark Pesce, to understand the lay of the land as it currently stands. Mark, what exactly does this Facebook data leak teach us about privacy?
It tells us how much privacy we've given away without perhaps really understanding how it happened. What we saw was not so much an erosion, but I think probably more like an opening. And into that opening was injected all sorts of things that continually sort of reported on what websites we were going to, that would track our location, that would read the location data off the photographs that we posted. And all of this data that we were giving away, mostly not well aware of it, has been collected and used to build almost a simulation of us inside of Facebook. And now Facebook can decide how it wants to talk to you based on what it knows about you from that simulation.
And when you say this opening opened up, that sounds rather passive. It sounds like we were just stumbling along through civilization and we tripped and oops, so now there's an opening. Here's a little portal which has all of our data. But to what extent is this something that is extremely cleverly and shrewdly calculated by wonks in Silicon Valley?
Perhaps I should have said it was more like a puncture wound than an opening, because that's
Right.
really what I meant. And it really was something like that. It was more like a hypodermic that's injecting all of this stuff. Like you can imagine sort of a science fiction James Bond movie, and they inject a tracking device into the hero's blood so that when he's in the lair, and it's almost more like that. There were a set of decisions that were made at Facebook, some of them in very early days, but a lot of them more in 2011, 2012, just as the company was preparing to go public. How do we make money? Okay, well, we'll do advertising. And because we know so much about our users, we can target advertising better. And they then leaned into that. So they basically went, wait, we have all this data. We can get so fine with our understanding of them. And we can use that to tune the Facebook feed, which is great for them. And you can use it for our advertisers. And that's great for Cambridge Analytica. And this is sort of how you can see how a business decision, when coupled with Silicon Valley boffins, can really amplify into something that's completely out of control.
So what is this thing that's completely out of control? Basically, let's take the most charitable perspective from Facebook, right?
Yeah.
I can imagine being at Facebook and saying to myself, we're in the business of connecting people. Yeah. We're in the business of making sure that there is as much freedom of intellectual movement online as possible. This is the 21st century. Mark is just laughing. But, bear with me. This is the way these people think and talk. You've spoken to them.
Oh, they swallowed the Kool-Aid. I agree with you.
And so why don't we just have as close and granular an understanding of all of the attributes of each individual person so that we know better how to pair them with whatever advertisers or other people or institutions they may be interested in connecting with. Because you're going to see an ad anyway. Why should I see an ad that's about something that doesn't interest me when I could see an ad that is perfectly tailored to precisely my demographic and set of interests?
So let's talk about how this actually worked in practice. On the 1st of May last year, front page story in The Australian, they had seen an advertising deck that was created by the co-CEOs of Facebook Australia, which was being marketed to all of the big advertisers in Australia, in which they explained step by step that they could identify exactly when a teenager was feeling vulnerable or worthless in the moment, in real time, and alert the advertiser that that was the correct time to send them an ad. So while you're talking about this beautiful world of sharing and identifying and targeting, what Facebook is doing is they're using what they know to basically undermine the autonomy of the person. And so while what you're saying, and this is why I was laughing, sounds really good in theory, the actual practice of it, Facebook, quote unquote, apologized, and we've been hearing nothing but apologies from Facebook. They apologized for it, but nothing else was really said. They just kind of pretended it didn't happen. But there's nothing to indicate that that's not still standard operating procedure at Facebook. And so this is why we have to be very, very suspicious about any attempt to say, oh, well, we're helping the world share. No, you're helping yourselves to our sharing in order to help you along. But what benefit is that really bringing us?
What's the status quo on the rest of the internet and the other big internet companies? Because, Google is no angel here. You type in a Google search term. If you're logged into your Gmail account, all of a sudden things start popping up and trying to sell you things that are related to that search terms, which is quite tricky when you're a journalist or a media personality like me, because I'm constantly researching things that I have no interest in whatsoever for a story. And then all of a sudden I'm being advertised galoshes.
Although that's also good in a way because it's keeping the search engine from knowing you and your needs well because you're feeding it bad data. And that's actually one of the strategies going forward is to actually sort of try to confuse these systems as much as possible or to feed them something weird enough that when it comes back to you, you know it was fed back in. So there's an actual strategy around that. Google Originally, their founding statement was "Don't be evil," right? I think that disappeared, but I think it got replaced tacitly by the "Don't look evil." And they're much better at not looking evil than Facebook. There's no question that Google knows more about either of us than Facebook does. Full stop. All right? They've been tracking us for longer. They've built this profile. They seem to have negotiated a way into making that profile yield the maximum utility for us and the minimum amount of evil on them. Whether that's going to be true in a year or 2 years, we don't know, but it's clear that Google has had a different approach. And, one of the maxims at Facebook has been to go fast and break things. And they've broken a lot of things now, and it's now actually affecting the company. Google seems to be much more careful about this. But of course, it's not just Google. It's also Amazon. It's also Microsoft. All of these companies now have enormous data repositories on us. And so we now need to deal with the fact that there's a lot of data about us that's completely out of our control. At the end of May, the General Data Protection Regime, the GDPR, you're going to hear a lot about this, is going to go into effect in the EU. It's basically a best practice for how companies are allowed to collect data transparently, how they're telling you it's being used, and how they're telling you who it's being sold to. And if that works there, we're going to start to see a lot of very interesting things pop up that we never saw before because companies will be forced to show that off. And it may be that can become a template for the way things need to work, say, in Australia or maybe even in America.
And one of the things that Zuckerberg was saying when he testified to Congress recently was that it's possible that Facebook would consider extending those EU regulations to the entirety of Facebook's platform so that those more stringent regulations that had been drawn up in the European Union might apply to everyone. Does that have a snowflake's chance in summer?
So the initial reviews of this are in, and effectively, even in the EU, Facebook is complying with the letter of the law, not the spirit. So I think that this is because the collection and monetization of user data is the core feature of Facebook's business model. It's very much like trying to get an addict off heroin because they're organized around that. That's what they do. And for them to understand that this is actually harming them, and it's clear that it is harming them, because if this goes on, people will simply cease to trust Facebook. And that actually presents a bigger problem for us because most social groups now organize around Facebook. And so people want to leave Facebook and can't because they're going to leave their paragliding group or their surfing group or their cat fanciers group. And they don't want to do that.
Heaven forbid. You mentioned Amazon. This is one of those areas where the relinquishment of data is in some ways good for us, at least superficially and in the short term. So I can go to Amazon, and the moment I've logged in, it can check me out with one click. I don't have to enter any information. I don't have to tell it where I live. I don't have to put in my credit card information. It can give me suggestions of books on the basis of things that I've listened to on Audible, which is owned by Amazon. And it really it understands me as well as I understand me, at least in terms of my book reading preferences. Is that a price worth paying?
Well, I guess it depends on knowing what the full deal is. And do we know what the full deal is? Is that all of the ways that the data is being used? Is it being used in other ways? Is it being used to browbeat publishers into lowering prices in their books on that? I mean, because you see, there's multiple ways. Yeah, I know it is because I have friends in publishing. It's all of these different things. And so when you take a look at an entity that is as large as Amazon, that has as much data as Amazon does, yes, it can be used to help you, but is it also being weaponized either against you or against someone else? And I think this is the danger zone because companies want to do that because it gives them competitive advantage. But at the same time, it means that your data is being used in a way that you would never willingly allow.
There's a difference surely between a question of monopolistic behavior, where a company as huge as Amazon is able to use its clout to strong-arm publishers to get lower prices, and the nefarious use of my data and the invasion and an intrusion on my privacy.
Well, I think that there's a gradient there. I mean, at one level, it's just pure monopoly power. And at another level, it's the collecting of data. But there's something about the collecting of data that amplifies that monopoly power. So that's why it's not as cut and dry as this. And we have to sort of take a look at these issues really carefully because when you look at Amazon, you see a big company with a few monopolistic practices and some really, really bad practices for the workers in its warehouses and whatnot. And you go, okay, how can I affect that company? How can I make that company behave better? And if Amazon's holding all the data on you, then maybe they're not going to be able to listen because they can pre-anticipate and they can kind of ignore you.
If I'm a young person who's grown up with the internet, well, I say if, I mean, I am sufficiently young that I don't remember there not being an internet.
Wow.
And then why do I care particularly about privacy? There are these big faceless companies. They have all kinds of data points about me, but they don't necessarily connect it to me as an individual. They have this kind of, as you say, almost digital alter ego of Josh Zepps.
Yeah.
And that makes my life more convenient in some ways. Who cares?
There are things that digital alter ego knows about you that you have never told probably anyone except for a few other people, but can be divined from your actions in this world. You know, there's the famous example of the woman who was, I think, 16, who started receiving lots of circulars from Target because Target had figured out that she was pregnant because the algorithm said she was, and she hadn't told her parents. And there's kinds of things like that. So there can be political preference, there can be sexual preference, there can be kink. You know, it doesn't really, but it's the kinds of things that we would choose to hide or reveal, but where we have the choice and we get deprived of that choice. So those choices define us as people. They define, because it's more the things that we don't say to others that define who we are than the things that we do say. And so if you have these entities that have worked out all of these aspects of you, in some ways what they're doing is they're defining you rather than you defining yourself. And so you can say privacy, does someone know something, does someone not know something? That's less important than, do I have a choice here? Do I have a choice to be this way or not be this way, to share this thing or not share this thing?
And so if someone knew a set of details about me, X, Y, Z, then they might be able to link that to a set of other details about me, ABC.
Yeah.
And the latter were things that I'd rather not have known.
Yes, exactly. And that's very common. That's been shown. You know, there's a bunch of work that was done around the time that I quit Facebook. And I quit Facebook 8 years ago now, because there was a bunch of work that's been done at Harvard to show that if, in fact, you're in a social network and people start getting divorced in a social network, you're more likely to get divorced. If you're in a network of fat people, you're more likely to gain weight. If you're in a network of smokers, you're more likely to smoke. Of course, like attracts like, but it became really clear that you could learn things about people simply by how they were connecting and communicating that they would never talk about themselves.
Mark Pesce, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
I'm Josh Zepps. You're listening to The People Versus on RN. You can find us via the RN homepage or the ABC Listen app. Also, subscribe to the podcast and you will never, ever miss an episode. Let's meet some of the people on The People Versus properly this time. The three real people, the people's people on The People Versus, are Kat in Melbourne, Weston from Orange, and Erica in Mackay. G'day, Kat.
Hi Josh.
Can you tell us a little about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I am a freelance journalist and I'm also a yoga bar Pilates instructor in Melbourne. So I totally understand what you were saying about researching things and all of a sudden your ads, your social media feed are filled with whatever that is, because I pitched a story. I only pitched it. I wasn't even doing much research on something to do with weddings. And all of a sudden, Google, Facebook, Instagram are filled with ideas for my wedding, which I've got to tell you is pretty depressing.
Do you care about this question of privacy?
Absolutely, but I also think I'm actually kind of glad that the Cambridge Analytica happened, because I spent about 20 minutes the other day going through my settings on Facebook and realising that competitions that I'd entered 3 years ago still had access to my list of friends and my email. And I even said to one of my classes this morning, you know, are you aware that when you go to Facebook settings, you can do this? And I guess a lot of people become complacent. I think I've always, because I studied multimedia and I've worked in digital media, I've had that awareness of how data is used. I guess I got complacent as well, and I didn't realise that about 200 apps had access still to all my data, but it was really, for me, a wake-up call to clear that. I never like some people, went, I am getting off Facebook, I'm getting off this social media business. For me, I think I accept that if I get free access to Facebook and free access to Instagram and et cetera, there's a price to pay. Nothing is genuinely free.
As the old adage goes, if you're doing something that's free online, then the product that's being sold is you.
Absolutely.
Weston, you live in Orange, just outside of Orange, but you're joining us from Newcastle today. Can you tell us a little about yourself?
I'm chartered accountant. I've lived in Sydney for about the last 40 years and moved up to Springside outside of Orange last year. Fantastic little place. It's a big move, so moving from the centre of Sydney to Springside, it highlights these privacy issues where you've got solitude, you've got space around you.
Do you feel like you have privacy when you're living in a small regional community, or does the fact that you're online mean that digitally it's just the same?
No, you have. I think you feel different about privacy. You certainly have more of your own time, and the way you behave is more how you want to behave rather than expectations of other people. One of the things that I'd like to hear today, and I don't know whether we can cover it, is whether you can cleanse your data.
We will definitely get...
How long does it take if you have a diet to clean your liver or something? How long does it take to cleanse your data?
Yeah, good luck with that. Erica in Mackay in Queensland, g'day.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, good. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm 40-ish, a solo parent to an 11-year-old little gentleman, and been in central Queensland most of my life.
How do you feel about all this debate?
It's a tricky thing. I think there needs to be a definition of privacy and a definition of data. So, because some people think that, the privacy of a psychologist sort of stuff, and then they don't put it to privacy online of what they like in way of cats or whatever.
You're a parent, as you say, of an 11-year-old boy. And what interaction does he have with social media and a digital world?
Not so much social media, but like Xbox Live.
Yeah.
So, that chatting in games and stuff like that.
One of the things that I just want to make clear to people is exactly how Facebook is getting this data and what the breach was. So, for example, I've got a document here which enables an advertiser to target a particular demographic. So, if you want to reach a collection of cyclists between the age of 18 to 35 who are female, who live within 20 miles of your store, who are interested in cycling and who are users of iPhones, you can tell Facebook that that's what you want to do, and they will place your ad directly in front of exactly those people. And in terms of the apps being breached, there is a pop-up which says people on Facebook who can see your info can bring it with them when they use apps. This makes their experience better and more social. These are Facebook's words. Use the settings below to control the categories of information that people can bring with them when they use apps, games and websites. And there's a list. I'll read it out because it's interesting. Biography, birthday, family and relationships, things I'm interested in, religious and political views, my website, if I'm online, posts on my timeline, hometown, current location, education and work, activities, interests, things I like, and my app activity. Let's go to our Brains Trust. Tim Dean is a moral philosopher at the University of Sydney and a faculty member of the School of Life, where he presents philosophy to the general public. And Shara Evans is a technology futurist who presents keynote speeches all over the world. Shara, do you think that most people who are sharing their little apps, which are giving them quizzes about their personality type, have gone into the settings and are aware that the religious and political views of all of their friends are going to be available to whoever the developer was that created the app they're using?
Absolutely not. I've had discussions with a number of people over the last few weeks since the, quote, Cambridge Analytica scandal is broken, and they've been gobsmacked at the amount of information that's collected. And it goes beyond apps, too, because if you're an Android user and you downloaded the Facebook app, say, a number of years ago, Google, at that point with its Android operating system, had very wide permissions available for any app that you downloaded on that platform, including the ability to capture metadata, information about who you called or who you texted. And guess what? Facebook was collecting all of that information about your private communications even outside of the Facebook app without your knowledge, consent, or even a click wrap agreement to do so. The privacy violation is just massive. And when I talk to people about that, they say, really, they could do that? And they also express a lot of surprise that even if they personally do not use Facebook, but one of their friends may use Facebook and have uploaded their address book or their contact list, then Facebook or other social media organizations or app developers may now have profile information on them, people who are not even using that particular app. And in fact, that's partially at the heart of this whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, in that only 270,000 people decided to download that particular app and participate in a survey. But because of the exponentiality of reaching friends, they were able to target over 87 million people's profiles.
And one thing that I only learned in this latest crisis was the fact that when you use Facebook Messenger, for example, the instant messaging service, which is just like sending text messages to somebody, it'll handily prompt you whether or not you want to cross-reference it with the contacts that are in your smartphone. And I assumed that what it was doing was seeing whether or not any of those contacts were also already on Messenger so that it could import their contact information and make life easier. No, it was looking at all of your contacts and in fact saving all of those contacts. So even things like the code, my banking password or something that I might have saved in an encoded form in my contacts as a secure note-keeping location, that too is now with Facebook. This gets back to what Kat, one of our people on the People versus in Melbourne, was talking about how this has just reminded her that you once gave authorization years ago to some app that you've long forgotten about, and it still has access to spy on all of your data. Tim Dean, our moral philosopher, and one of our brains trusts this week, each week on the People versus our listeners chime in on Facebook, which is perhaps somewhat ironic given the subject matter this week. But Margaret wrote on the RN Facebook page, I always thought privacy was a bourgeois construct. I think there is sometimes a sense that if relinquishing my privacy is convenient, then why should I care?
Sure. And I suppose it's interesting to put it in a little bit of historical context, which is we didn't really care about privacy up until a little over 100 years ago. It was a term that really entered our, I guess, political lexicon in around about 1890. And that was when newspapers were really exploding in popularity, particularly in the United States, and photography as well. And so a few people came together and said, this is new and this is problematic because now there are these mass media organizations that are able to take photographs of people, talk about who they are, and then telegraph this out to thousands or millions of other people. And so even though we've for a very long time had a kind of an idea of a distinction between the stuff I do in my own home, in my own relationships, and the stuff I do in public, and we don't really worry about the stuff in public as much because we're somehow agreeing to telegraph this to the world. But the stuff that we do in our own homes is somehow protected. I mean, this distinction goes back to Aristotle, who talked about the distinction between the public and the private, or the political and the home life. But it was really only around 1890 that we realized that the changing face of media is affecting the way that we control our information or lose control of that information. And it's really interesting to see that now it's almost come full circle where people have said, look, the genie's out of the bottle and maybe the easiest thing to do is just not care about it. I mean, that distinction still remains between the public and the private. It's just whether we care enough to try to keep that distinction alive.
That's Tim Dean, the moral philosopher, who's one of our brains trusts on the People versus Privacy this week. Tim, I think there's one thing that I keep feeling frustrated that gets elided in this conversation, which is it privacy if you consent to giving it up? And is it not privacy if you don't consent to giving it up? In other words, like you were just talking, Shara, about the fact that there are all of these apps that have so much more information about us than we ever anticipated giving them when we just clicked on something on Facebook. But had we known all of what we were getting into, would it be kosher? In other words, is consent the crucial thing here?
the distinction, the definition of privacy is problematic. I should get like a badge as a philosopher saying, ask me about definitions and I will tell you they're all complicated. There's no agreement specifically on what privacy really means, but there are a few different approaches and a few different schools of thought about what privacy even is. And this is important because if what we could be ending up doing is talking across each other, arguing for and against privacy, and we might have different ideas.
Right.
One idea of privacy, which is maybe a more old-fashioned folk idea of privacy, which is that that stuff which I do in my own home, I should keep away from the public sphere. And it's like I have an obligation to keep it away. And I think a lot of people, particularly non-millennials, still subscribe to this idea of privacy, of saying there's information that it's not only that I should have control over it, it's just that I should not ever let it out. And another notion of privacy is not as much about this kind of obligation to restrict. It's about control. And that is actually a popular definition in philosophical circles, is privacy is about our ability, and it's kind of a part of our autonomy as free individuals to decide what information we can release and not release. And that becomes relevant when we're talking about Facebook, because maybe we might feel ostensibly that we have decided to give over some information. But what we're finding is we've made a decision to give over a little bit of information, and actually Facebook has taken a lot of information. And once it's taken that information, then we lose the control. So even if we had control on that first decision, you tick that terms and conditions box or whatever it is, then you lose control. And that's arguably where the privacy breach is taking place.
But can't you choose to lose control?
You can. And so according to the definition of privacy as control, you can say, I'm going to let my information become public. And in knowing that once it becomes public, it is outside of your control. But there are gradients.
I mean, there are all kinds of scenarios in which I voluntarily relinquish control. When I get on a plane, I'm relinquishing my ability to be in control of my own safety, and I'm outsourcing that to the pilot.
Precisely. When you go and see a doctor, you volunteer to give up some private information within a controlled sphere. So you've given it up, but you still maintain control because there are boundaries on how that information is used. The issue with what we're hearing about online at the moment is we make this initial decision believing that it's going to be used in a bounded sense, but it's
then
unbounded.
The doctor runs out the back door of the clinic and starts selling your information to third parties.
Which has happened not with doctors, but with pharmacists, for example. There have been pharmacists in the US and even in Australia who've been selling prescription information onto other organizations that will then sell that to pharmaceutical companies, because that's very valuable information. And we thought we were giving it to a very nicely contained little pile, and that pile was then opened up outside of our control.
You're listening to The People Versus. I'm Josh Zepps. It's the show in which we take one big ethical issue ripped from the headlines, and the people of Australia in ABC radio studios around the country wrestle with it. This week, privacy and the Facebook conundrum. On the RN Facebook page, ironically, responding to the question we posed, does privacy still exist? One of our listeners, Ken, wrote, yes, it does, but we should really take a moment to define what this right is, because most Australians don't understand it and take it for granted. Shara Evans, our futurist, what is privacy?
Well, it really varies by country, but let me just go back to the UN. The UN has a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that it put together in 1948. And in that declaration, it basically said that privacy is an inane human right. It is just built into who we are as human beings. The UN has also been doing a lot of work over the past few years on what privacy means in a digital age. And I'll just read you a couple of extracts from some of the latest UN documentation. And they say that the right to privacy is important for the exercise of freedom of expression, including the right to seek, receive, and impart information, and contributes to the development of an individual's ability to participate in political, economic, social, and cultural life. They also talk about metadata. That's the collection of information about who you've called or who you've sent text information to, or where a photograph was originated. And they say that metadata can reveal personal information and can give an insight into an individual's behavior, social relationships, private preferences, and identity. And they go on to express severe concerns that individuals often do not provide their free, explicit, and informed consent to the sale or indeed multiple resale of their personal data as part of the data collection processing. And if you think about the things that you might have clicked and said, yes, I agree, many of those documents are multi-page legalese, and most people do not read them. So even though they click agree, they do it in the moment because they need to get access to a particular application or a particular private Facebook group, as an example, but they haven't read the 10 or 20-page legal document that goes along with it. But not only that, when they make that agreement to use an application, they're agreeing to something at a particular point in time, but these privacy terms routinely are changed at a whim by organizations. And there is even more concern on my part as we start to see these very large social media companies acquire other smaller companies that you may have at first agreed to their privacy terms, but now they're incorporated into a much larger entity, and those terms have changed. And suddenly information that you're using on a standalone messaging app like WhatsApp is part and parcel of a much bigger data collection organization and operation. And the inferences that can be derived from that massive amount of data are much greater than could have been derived in an original standalone application. And one of the questions that I'm starting to ask is, are these massive privacy violations actually crimes against humanity?
Let's check in with the people. Weston from Orange, joining us from the Newcastle studios. What do you make of this idea that you can relinquish control by clicking on I agree, and then all of your data gets used in ways that you didn't necessarily know you were agreeing to?
I think it's absolute rubbish. but I think where the conversation has been going, and we've been trying to define privacy, which is really important to the essential debate, we were also talking about releasing information about friends and contacts on Facebook and other social media. And so by agreeing, you're actually breaching the privacy of all those other contacts. And that's a troubling concept too.
Yeah, Kat in Melbourne, how do you feel about that? The fact that third parties who have nothing to do with the fact that you clicked agree. I mean, 270,000 people downloaded these apps, and then 87 million people got caught up in them.
I actually think that we're demonising major companies, and we're getting too caught up talking about Facebook when, people need to take some responsibility for what they're doing. And if you're sharing photos and your location and your lunch and everything that you're doing throughout the day, I think we've got to take some responsibility for the fact that we've downloaded this app and we've given permission, but if we don't read it, then there is a price to be paid. And I think breaches of privacy are not a new thing. They're not the internet. I think ultimately the question is not so much defining privacy, but saying, why are we not educating ourselves? Why are we not asking for more transparency so that we're informed?
Erica in Mackay, it's a good point that Kat in Melbourne makes, right?
Definitely. Like the whole, we need to know what's happening, and what I want to know is, how do I make money off my data if it keeps on getting it sold? Like, how do we do that?
I'm glad, Kat, that you raised the point that this is not just about Facebook, and it doesn't, and privacy concerns predate the digital revolution. I just want to take a look at a couple of case studies which I find really interesting in terms when the US Supreme Court has had to grapple with privacy and with what cops can and can't do. Back in 2001, there was a federal agent who suspected that a guy was growing marijuana in his home. And one way that you can tell if someone's growing marijuana in their home is to shine a radiant heat detector at the house, because if they've got hydroponics, then there's going to be one room that's especially hot. So this cop parked his car across from the guy's house, and he aimed this thermal imager at the house. He found that there was pot being grown inside the house, and he prosecuted him. Well, that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States said, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that without a warrant, because that is actually a search of the guy's house. Even though you're sitting in a cop car across the road, that's a search. A similar story came out in 2011. The cops in the States arrested 4 guys for robberies. And at the trial, they used data that they'd gotten from one of their smartphones as to the guy's location. So whenever you're walking around a city with your phone, obviously it's pinging off of local mobile phone receptors, mobile phone towers. They got that information and they used that to pinpoint him at all of these different locations. And again, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, you're essentially retroactively tracking this person and you hadn't gotten a warrant in order to track him. And there was a similar case in 2012 where they attached a GPS tracking device to a suspect's car and tracked it around. And they said to the Supreme Court, the cops did, look, we could have tailed him. I mean, we could have just, it's a public, he was doing a public activity, driving around the city. We could have put a cop car on his tail and we could have driven him around. The Supreme Court said, no, if you had wanted to do that, then that would have taken resources and that you would have actually had to allocate police officers and vehicles. And the act of attaching something to the guy's car was a search. So this is a very, very muddy area, both legally and morally, regardless of whether or not we're talking about Facebook. Tim,
Josh, could I
please.
ask a question?
Yeah.
One of my major concerns, and no one's been able to give me an answer, so maybe we can put it out there to the public this morning, but working in gyms, I see a lot of people now snapping photos of themselves or recording a video, here's my clean and snatch, wow, isn't it amazing? And then they share it to their, Instagram. Now, inevitably, when you're taking photos of yourself in a crowded space, other people are going to be in that photo. Now, I've spoken to management at the gyms where I work, where I've seen this happen, and said, is there a rule around selfies and getting a whole lot of other people in that shot? Because just to be realistic about how that could be used, maybe you skip work. Maybe you tell your boss you are hideously sick at home vomiting, and there you are doing Pilates and someone's taken a photo. That has repercussions for your employment and for your personal credibility. And management has not been able to give me a solid answer on whether it's legal and whether they actually allow that to happen.
That's Kat in Melbourne, one of our people's people on the People Versus. Tim, it's a good point, isn't it? What are the ethics of accidentally getting caught in the background of someone else's shot when you're chucking a sickie?
Yes, the ethics are very complicated when you go to work the next day. But, I mean, people have been taking photographs for decades. Inevitably, there are people who are caught up in the background. Typically, those photographs were not publicly available, though. They were kept with a limited kind of circulation. When they were publicly available, like when they were used by the media would need to get permission from people to be included in certain circumstances, not in all circumstances when people weren't identifiable. But this is now an issue that's not just like big media organizations are having to think about. This is actually everyone. When we take photographs, we don't know who is going to be affected by this kind of thing.
Let me just go back to the point that Kat was raising about people being caught up in pictures and having them uploaded onto social media sites or other platforms. One of the technologies that's available today that wasn't available widespread a few years ago is instant facial recognition. And that means that it's not just up for someone to have randomly seen that picture of you in the gym and identify you. You are automatically tagged with your name, identity, location, and as being part of that particular picture. And this technology is getting very, very good and extremely fast. For example, NEC has a product called NeoFace that can scan a database of 1.6 million people and in a third of a second identify an individual's image. That's how fast this technology is. But let's say that you're not actually doing something wrong, like taking a sickie. What if you're caught in a picture outside of a cancer clinic and you want to keep that private and personal, and you don't necessarily want your employer or other people around you to know that you might be battling with a health situation? That's not about you doing something wrong or even having something that is morally wrong, on your part to want to hide. It's about your personal privacy and the things that you want to keep out of the public domain as opposed to in the public domain. And the technologies are getting so fast, and the assimilation of these massive databases to put together all kinds of disparate information and profile you is something that can be quite troubling and quite scary, even if you're not doing anything wrong morally or ethically at all.
I'm glad you raised facial recognition software. It's about to go mainstream whether we like it or not. This is how Sky News in the UK described what it can do.
Surveillance is obviously crucial to the police and intelligence agencies, and counter-terrorism makes it even more vital. What facial recognition allows, though, is the computer to pick your face out of a crowd. Rather than just being kept tabs on, you're tracked in real time. It's mass surveillance for the physical world.
Sky News has learned that more than 20 million facial images are now held by the police, which could correspond to nearly a third of the UK population.
China is already using this widely in security, looking for terrorists or people who have warrants out for their arrest. But they're also using it to let people pay in fast food restaurants, to access theme parks without having to buy a ticket, and even, bizarrely, to try and catch people who steal loo paper from public toilets.
That was Hal Hodson, the technology writer for The Economist there. You're listening to The People Versus with me, Josh Sepps. This week it's The People versus Privacy. Let's go to the people. Weston in our Newcastle ABC studios. How do you feel about facial recognition?
The facial recognition side just expands the whole debate enormously. I think Kat at the start said there's no such thing as a free lunch, and said that part of the price of having access to social media was about you participated and gave up so much information. And I think just how much information we're giving up and getting the price right is just way out of bounds at the moment.
Erica in Mackay in Queensland, how do you feel about the possibility that photographs that your 11-year-old son could be snapped in by accident could have him connected via facial recognition to the rest of his and your life online?
I don't like it. I think, with everything getting hacked, like how can you know that those government databases of your, photos of people that you don't even post online are going to be available? Like, you just don't know. Like, how far can it go? Like, what's the worst case scenario?
Well, I think something we need to think about is, again, what privacy means. And often privacy is related to trust. So the value that we place in privacy is kind of inverse to how much we trust other people. If we lived in a society that was run by a benevolent dictator and everyone loved them and they loved us and we all had the same views and the same beliefs and nobody disagreed, we would have less need for privacy. However, we don't live in that world. We live in a world where there are powers that are trying to exert their influence over us. There are businesses that are trying to make money out of us. There are people with views that disagree with us that would like to change our views. So we don't trust that the way we live our lives, the feelings that we have, the thoughts that we have, the beliefs that we have can be always expressed safely. So we need to have some protection. So a pillar of the liberal democracy that we live in is that it's built around the idea that people disagree. It's built around the idea that certain authorities cannot be trusted with absolute power. So to the degree that we don't trust these things, we need to have that privacy to control our own autonomy and our own freedom. Now, we were talking about Facebook and social media before and the problems that face, which are kind of business problems. They are making money by exploiting our information. A far more serious concern is when either malevolent organisations or governments can take and abuse this information as well. So we know, for example, that the Australian government has restricted access to places like Nauru and Manus Island. They've restricted journalistic access. They're restricting information there. They're blocking things. We know that the government has agendas that it wants to control, and it doesn't want information to get out, and it is willing to manipulate other people to prevent that information getting out. Now, we already know that there are some of those slips with our government right now. Can we trust, and this is an open question, I don't know the answer to this, but can we trust our government if it is given the power to breach our privacy? If it is given the power, like the Chinese government has, to scan a crowd and pick somebody out, or use an algorithm to determine the likelihood that someone in that crowd might carry drugs and then search that person. Are we comfortable with that? And then, do we also trust, this is another dimension, the government to protect, or the business to protect our information such that it won't be hacked and fall into other hands, whether they're criminals or activists? The Ashley Madison thing is alarming because it was activists, people who had a moral agenda to expose these people, who are sometimes the activists who are the most dangerous people when it comes to manipulating the data that we would like to control. Do we trust these organisations? And if we answer no to some degree, then I think that's where the value of privacy becomes more focused.
Let's wrap up with the people. Kat in Melbourne, what are your final thoughts?
I think organisations and educational institutions and private business need to massively catch up. I think it's brilliant what the EU is doing with the opt-in, so that people actually have to, rather than automatically have their email taken or their data taken, and it's an opt-out, they have to actually say, no, we're protected unless we say it's okay. But I think from school levels through to uni, through to workplaces, there needs to be clarification around the data that's being taken, around educating kids through to adults about here's how you can protect yourself as much as possible, because people are lazy and we're complacent because there's so much else to do in our lives. I think we need our workplace and our educational institutions to say, here's how you look after yourself, and to be realistic about the fact that you can't hide in a cave, you can't be completely private. Here's the best that you can do to look after yourself.
Thanks, Kat. Weston from Orange in Newcastle, what do you reckon?
I really like Tim's point about privacy is inversely proportional to trust. That resonates for me, and that unless you have that trust, you need to have protections in place. Kat's obviously right about taking personal responsibility for how you behave online, but I really think that we just don't know how far down the rabbit hole we're going. And on that trust issue, I think back at Sarajevo, which had the Winter Olympics in 1984 and was at war in 1992. So the person you trust now, are they the people, who
will be trustworthy forever? Yes, very few people are. Erica, we've got about 30 seconds. Your final thoughts from Mackay.
I like the EU opt-in thing. I think that we should definitely look into that, and definitely education. We can't rely on businesses to look out for ourselves. We have to take it on ourselves to mess with the algorithm.
It's going to be fascinating to think of the world that your 11-year-old son is going to be growing up into
it's very
he's
scary,
middle-aged.
and it puts a whole lot of pressure on parenting, that's for sure. But I reckon it'll be used it can be used against companies. So I think that once that starts happening, then rules will start changing.
On that optimistic note, I will thank our people on the People versus Erica and Mackay, Weston from Orange, joining us from Newcastle, and Kat in Melbourne. Thanks also to our Brains Trust, Tim Dean, moral philosopher at the University of Sydney, and Shara Evans, technology futurist and keynote speaker. If you want to get involved, go to the RN homepage, follow the links to the People Versus and put up your hand to be one of our people, or send us your opinion as a voice memo to The People Versus, that's The People VS, at your.abc.net.au. You can hear us again wherever you get your podcasts or on the ABC Listen app. I am person Josh Sepps. We'll see you next week on The People Versus.